Corruption, death squads, and a speeding carriage? These world leaders found themselves in trouble, and some even landed in prison. Nicolas Sarkozy was president of France from 2007 to 2012, and was perhaps most famous outside of that country for his marriage to supermodel Carla Bruni the year after taking office. But one can't have everything in life, and Sarkozy failed to win re-election in 2012. He had really wanted to win, too, so much so that he ignored France's strict spending rules for political campaigns, blowing through the maximum amount he was allowed to splash out. To those more used to US-style elections, the numbers seem comically tiny for a presidential campaign. Sarkozy spent about $50 million, which was double the approximately $25 million allowed by law. The prosecution argued that the then-president willfully ignored the overspending, while Sarkozy said it was ridiculous to think he paid close attention to details like that. In 2021, he was found guilty and sentenced to house arrest, although this was put on hold while the appeals process was ongoing. Amazingly, that wasn't even the first time Sarkozy was convicted of crimes that year. 7 months earlier, he was found guilty in a different trial on charges of effectively bribing a judge for legal information about a case he was not privy to in 2014. After he lost his appeal in 2023, he was ordered to spend 1 year under house arrest and wear an ankle monitor, with an additional 2 years of his sentence suspended. Jacob Zuma was an important figure in South Africa long before he became the country's third democratically elected president after the end of apartheid. He was heavily involved in the fight to end that injustice, along with Nelson Mandela and so many others, so it was perhaps not surprising that he won the presidency in 2009. However, by that point, the sheen was already slightly off the freedom fighter as he was facing accusations of corruption before he even took office. Once he had real power, things got worse. Over the 9 years he spent in office, Zuma allowed shocking levels of corruption at the federal level, although he denied the allegations.
I'm saying I'm not a crook. I've never been a crook. I'll never be a crook.
After he left office in 2018, the country wanted to investigate what had gone wrong, so a commission was set up to look into Zuma's corruption. But when compelled to appear, the former president refused. He was charged with contempt of court and sentenced to 15 months in prison in 2021, a decision he compared to both apartheid and a death sentence. At first, he said he would not turn himself in, and his supporters threatened violence. But in the end, minutes before the police would have taken him by force, he surrendered himself to custody. He served only a few months before being granted parole for medical reasons. This decision was quickly overturned, but he was released just a few hours after being processed. The arrest of former President Donald Trump was unprecedented in the United States. While he was under several active criminal investigations in 2023, the first one to lead to charges was in New York City. The Manhattan District Attorney brought 34 felony cases against the former president, all relating to falsifying business records related to hush money payments made to cover up a sexual encounter with adult film star Stormy Daniels. Trump appeared in court for his arraignment on April 4, 2023, where he pleaded not guilty to all counts. In a post-arraignment speech to supporters at Mar-a-Lago that was covered by almost every major news network, Trump called out the judge who had been randomly assigned to his case and even mentioned the judge's family members.
I have a Trump-hating judge with a Trump-hating wife and family.
This led to dozens of threats against them over just the next 24 hours. The wheels of justice turned slowly, and Trump was not expected to be back in court for a hearing until December 2023, with a trial not starting until possibly as late as spring 2024, which could be interesting timing if Trump is still in the running for president at that point. In June 2023, the former president was indicted in Florida for his handling of classified documents after he left office. Then in August, special counsel Jack Smith indicted Trump in federal court for crimes related to his attempts to overturn the 2020 election. Juan Perón was president of Argentina on and off for several years, and is also famous as the husband of Eva Evita Perón. After Evita died, Juan met and married Isabel Martinez. Juan died while in office in 1974, and his widow became president since she had been serving as vice president. Isabel Perón was not a politician, and within 2 years, she had been ousted in a coup. She not only lost her job, but found herself under arrest, spending the next 5 years under house arrest, charged with misappropriating money from a charity. In 1981, she was released and moved to Spain. By 1983, she'd received an official pardon, and it was even thought she would return home and run for office again. In the end, she stayed in Europe. In early 2007, on orders from an Argentinian judge, Isabel was arrested in Spain, this time charged with crimes against humanity. She was suspected of masterminding state-sponsored terrorism during her time in charge and running death squads. Others were also charged, but her last name made her particularly important to be held accountable. However, in 2008, Spain refused Argentina's extradition request. On paper, Mohamed Ould Abdel Aziz sounds like an almost faultless leader of the Western African nation of Mauritania. He came to power in a 2008 coup, sure, but so had all the other presidents of the country at that point, and at least his was bloodless. While in office, he worked hard to end the violence that had been raging for years. He served just 2 terms before stepping down by choice in 2019, peacefully handing the reins to the next president in an important first for Mauritania. However, while Aziz came from extremely humble roots, by the time he left office, he was rolling in dough, which some thought was rather suspicious. Mauritania's parliament looked into it and came away with plenty of evidence of corruption. In 2021, Aziz was charged with corruption and money laundering and arrested before he could flee to Europe. He was placed under house arrest until his trial was scheduled to begin in January 2023. Aziz denied he'd done anything wrong, and his lawyers pointed to conspiracies against their clients as reasons for the charges. After several delays due to pre-trial legal wrangling, Aziz's trial began on April 6, 2023. He pleaded not guilty.
It's an unprecedented trial in Mauritania.
Slobodan Milošević was still the Yugoslavian president when he was first charged with crimes against humanity by the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal in 1999, something that was unprecedented. Since he was still protected and powerful, there was serious doubt Milošević would ever actually end up in court, but in 2001 he was arrested and brought to The Hague for trial. By that point, there were even more charges against him for atrocities committed during the Balkan conflicts. The prosecution was taking no chances. Milošević was only charged with what they were sure they could prove, and they cut no corners when it came to the thoroughness of the trial. The prosecution's case was probably made easier by the fact Milošević represented himself in court. In the end, however, he got off on an extreme technicality. He died of a heart attack 2 months before the lengthy trial was finally due to end. Laurent Gbagbo had been in politics for decades when he was elected president of Côte d'Ivoire in 2000. However, only a couple of years into his tenure, the country descended into civil war. Presidential terms are 5 years in the West African nation, but Gbagbo managed to use the conflict to delay the 2005 election until 2010. Then, when he lost that election, he refused to concede to rival candidate Alassane Ouattara. The resulting violence was on another level, with thousands dying. A U.S. source told CNN at the time that blame for the horror should be placed squarely on Gbagbo, since he refused to accept that he lost. In November 2011, a warrant was issued for Gbagbo's arrest, and he was brought to the International Criminal Court for trial, charged with crimes against humanity. However, in 2019, Gbagbo and his co-defendant, Charles Blé were acquitted of all charges against them. In a 2-to-1 decision, the majority explained that the case was based on circumstantial evidence that did not sufficiently prove that there was any kind of coordinated plan of violence, and that there was not enough evidence to prove that the co-defendants were directing the violence, planned or not. The acquittal was later upheld on appeal. It would be another 3 years after he was first found innocent before Gbagbo returned to Côte d'Ivoire at the personal invitation of President Ouattara. Park Geun-hye was no stranger to the running of South Korea when she was elected president in 2012. In fact, she lived in the presidential palace as a child when her father was the dictator of the country. While her father's time in office ended with his assassination, hers ended in 2017 after her impeachment and removal from office due to corruption, and shortly after that, she found herself arrested. The next year, a court found Park guilty and sentenced her to 24 years. This was less than what the prosecution had asked for, but still harsh enough to send a clear message to the country's politicians. Within months, an appeals court increased the sentence to 25 years. Then a 2020 retrial saw her receive a 20-year sentence. Finally, in 2021, President Moon Jae-in pardoned Park in order to bring the country together so it could move on and fight the COVID-19 pandemic. Park was released from prison after serving 5 years.
I think it's really her advancing age and her health issues. She's had both physical and mental health issues.
The various arrests and criminal charges of Peru's former president Alberto Fujimori are quite the ride, so strap in. Fujimori was elected president in 1990 and stayed in the position until 2000. However, by that point, things were looking pretty bad for him and the walls were clearly closing in. So he took a vacation to Japan, at which point he broke up with his country by fax, informing the government of Chile he was resigning. By 2005, Fujimori had changed his mind and he returned to South America to run for president again. He didn't return directly to Peru, however, which meant his arrest for corruption and human rights abuses happened in neighboring Chile. There he languished in jail for 2 years before finally being extradited. Fujimori's first conviction came only a few months later when he was sentenced to 6 years for the illegal search of a residence, but that was just the start. In 2009, a different trial for human rights abuses led to a 25-year sentence. Just months after that, he got another 7.5 years for corruption. Perhaps sick and tired of being in court, Fujimori chose to plead guilty in the final case against him for bribery, almost exactly 2 years after he was returned to Peru. Despite that long list of crimes, in 2017, the then president of Peru pardoned Fujimori, which led to widespread protests in the country. The pardon was overturned by a court the following year. Not all world leaders are charged with crimes that shake the foundations of their governments. Back in the 1870s, Ulysses S. Grant, the then President of the United States, found himself repeatedly in trouble with the law in Washington, D.C. over something you might also have been dinged for: speeding. The difference, of course, is that cars barely existed at that point, and Grant was tearing around the Capitol in a horse-drawn carriage. Grant was a big fan of horses, even by comparison to others who lived in those horse-dependent times. He'd been obsessed with riding since he was a kid, followed horse racing closely, and was an exceptionally good trainer of his own horses. Like many people who do something they enjoy very well, Grant apparently liked to push the boundaries of what was acceptable when it came to taking his carriage out for a drive. While it sounds like an urban legend, it's been confirmed by the modern Washington, D.C. police service that Grant was indeed arrested for speeding in 1872, as well as being cited for it on a couple of other occasions. Not only was the President of the United States hauled off to the station, but his carriage and horse were also impounded.